Welcome to Arbor Sparks CEO Podcast, Conversations on Economic Opportunity. My name is Paul Krutko, and I'm the president and CEO of Arbor Spark. Welcome to a series of conversations that inform our work. Joining me today is Abrahm Lustgarten. Abrahm is editor-at-large for ProPublica, an award-winning investigative reporter and author of the book On the Move, The Overheating of the Earth and the Uprooting of America. This May, Abrahm was very gracious and came here to Ann Arbor and was the keynote speaker at Spark's annual meeting. So as a follow-up to his speech, I asked Abrahm to join me for today's podcast. So good to see you again.
Great to see you. Nice to be here.
So I just have a few things that I wanted to maybe share with an audience that didn't have the opportunity to come to the luncheon. So I know you shared when you were with us that you are a few years away from writing On the Move, but I'm curious about the genesis of you thinking and writing about this topic. What caused you to want to engage in this particular body of research and analysis?
Yeah, thanks. Great question. I mean, I cover climate change and I work on in-depth projects. And so we go back to around 2018 or so. I was looking for a new project, working with the New York Times Magazine, and really at that moment, feeling like there wasn't a lot of news coverage or thoughtful analysis of how climate change was affecting people, from a humanitarian perspective, how it would change our lives. A lot of conversation about the science and the cost and the disasters and all of that. So that was really the genesis. And then it was like, well, if you're going to take that approach, what does that mean? And a lot of quick research led very quickly to this topic of migration and immigration and just movement of people around the world. Basically, this question of how will a changing environment change where people live? What kind of environment or climate or circumstances will people choose to live in, and how will people thrive in those environments? And those are just sort of a set of simple questions that then you could look at in a whole bunch of different ways. In Central America, it was a question of refugees and migrants. I think in the United States, it's often a different question of how do you prepare for growth, or where will populations be increasing? Where will costs be decreasing or increasing, and things like that?
Yeah, and so one of the things I noted when I read the book the first time was there was a little bit of I would describe it, a personal touch to it, in the sense that you live in Northern California. You shared some sort of, you would just call them vignettes, I guess, of real people facing real decisions, right? And was that a key thing for you in thinking about this as well?
Yeah, I mean, my own experience was a key thing, and then I actually ended up kind of going in search of other people who shared that perspective. It wasn't hard to find, but that's how I settled on some of those characters. And I was at a moment of real indecision in my own life, and realizing that it was caused by I live in California, so in my case, it was caused by wildfires. It was hugely disrupting. It was uncomfortable. I was worried about the health of my kids and the danger of getting out of where my home is, and the property values of our neighborhood. And so it sort of was hitting on systemic levels. And then I realized that I'm not unique, that that's a story that a lot of people were experiencing, or had been for a long time if you live in Louisiana or in Texas, for example. Yeah, so that human experience again was the driving question, but it's also the way I like to try to tell stories. And in this case, it need a little bit of flushing out from the human perspective.
Yeah. So one of the things that you emphasized at the luncheon that I thought was really a good point, and something to reinforce with people reading the book or people just thinking about climate change or encountering this podcast, is that climate migration has been a constant through human history. Can you elaborate a bit on that? Because I think that's an insight that people need to think about. They think about climate change now, but climate change has been a significant factor in human history
Yeah.
for thousands of years.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that conversation starts with just changing the terminology to say we're talking about environmental circumstances, right? And so then it's kind of logical to realize that from the beginning of evolution, almost, people have thrived in places where they felt most comfortable in their environment. And so what that means is, early evolution, early hominids in Africa migrated northward out of, a desire to find a more hospitable environment, a wetter environment in that case. And that has been a pattern for thousands of years in lots of different ways on lots of different continents. But it culminates in recent research that begins to look at the same issue, economically, and finds that people thrive, Western civilization and OECD economies thrive in places in a certain band of temperature. So part of the conversation is about where people can't live, and the darker side of the climate conversation is about places becoming unlivable because they're too hot or because there's disasters. But the other side of the equation is that there are ideal circumstances for human thriving, and that most of our economic activity, across Europe, across the United States, corresponds with a certain temperature range in a certain part of the world. And so what the climate change conversation, is about to me is a continuation of that normalcy. But just acknowledging that those zones are moving, that climate change is shifting, what's ideal and where it's been. And then, of course, we have many more people on the planet, and the climate is changing much more rapidly than in the past. So it's a more disruptive process, but the basic structure and the basic form of it is familiar.
Yeah, and the reality is, in much of human history, there weren't artificial boundaries and people with weapons that prevented you from making that move. Well, you engage with really, in reading the book, some of the most knowledgeable, unbiased researchers on the subject of climate change and migration. What are some of your key takeaways from those conversations?
um, that the change is enormous, right? That it's driven by data and it's driven by scientific measurement. And you can exclude, I think, a lot of the subjective interpretation of what is most important in terms of how that's changing civilization or society, the cultural conversation, the political conversation. And you can drill right down to, the fact that our physical environment is changing. And, as a reporter, there's the experts I talk to, and I'll loop back to them. But just to say quickly, like as a reporter, um, I sought to speak with people in all parts of the country, regardless of political persuasion. And what I found is that everybody's experiencing this dramatic environmental change, and everybody's interested in that environmental change. And they just frame it differently. But there's no sort of denial that change is occurring, whether I'm in Texas or in Alabama or in California. And so, from back to those experts, from a data perspective, from a science perspective, we have recordings of temperature, of normal precipitation, of normal aridity. And we have models for how those are changing in the future based on what's already changed in the past. And those models are, in line with mainstream climate science, but they're also tested, and they project just a dramatic transformation. And so when you look at what's those temperature ranges that economics thrives in, for example, well, parts of the United States are not going to be in that thriving economic range, for example. And so the message that I hear is that, there's a lot of questions and a lot is unresolved, and we don't have all the answers. But what we can be pretty sure of is that we're kind of entering an era of unpredictability, and some degree of disruption, and we should be, ready for a bit of a wild ride.
Yeah, so as we speak today, this conversation is the third week of June here in Ann Arbor. We're in the midst of today. I just looked at the thermometer outside my house, 92 and a 106 heat index, which
Extraordinary.
is extraordinary for June in Michigan. Well, I get just a couple more. So sort of tying the concept of human migration through history and that research, you just talked about it a little bit. There is an optimal zone on Earth for humans. Given what we know from that research, what does it mean for the United States? And in particular, what does it mean for Michigan?
Yeah, so there's this idea of the climate niche, and there's a couple really significant peer-reviewed studies that basically find that for 6,000 years or so, which is how long they had records for the study, that people around the world have thrived in a certain range of temperature and precipitation. And it's most of the planet's population. It's generally the equatorial zones of the planet. And that research finds that those zones are shifting towards the poles. And because there's more land mass in the north, that generally means that the ideal human habitat is shifting northward towards the poles. And so the United States is, this is the way that I really look, this is the lens that I looked through to understand what's happening in the United States. And it's not as dramatic in the United States as it is, for example, in North Africa or in Brazil, because of our location on the globe, but it still means substantial change. And so, what those studies modeled suggests that the southernmost parts of the United States will be shifting towards the edge of, what is that human niche, not necessarily outside of it, not necessarily unlivable, but becoming more extreme. And that niche is moving northwards. And, where traditionally it has, that ideal zone really cut right across the middle of the United States. So, the southeastern United States, Kentucky, Tennessee, that kind of verdant band, that ideal habitat is moving northward. And depending on the rate of climate change, it could move towards the Great Lakes into you and Michigan, or it could move further northward, into Canada. But that is the general trend: is that
Mm,
that band that we've considered ideal is headed towards the northernmost parts of the United States.
mm. Okay, just my last one is, I found, and I think the audience did, because that's the feedback I got, was that the book is sobering, your presentation is sobering, but that audience is an audience that wants to know and is willing to hear about what is coming. Your final chapter was titled Opportunity, and one that you point out is that Great Lakes cities have substantive unused infrastructure, was one of the things you pointed out. So maybe please comment on that and any other things that you encountered that you thought represented opportunities.
Yeah, and I'll start with that apology for not being a trafficker in good news. I think that
Oh,
it's the nature of the business, but because there is a lot
no,
about
so
this
my
challenge.
goal in bringing you here was this is a community that is very concerned about climate change. The city has policies, direction, things that it's doing. But for me, there was this notion of, well, what does it mean if, and we saw some of it with the pandemic, of people moving,
Yeah,
moving. So that's a different issue if you're the place that is in the
absolutely.
niche, or different than if you're in a place that is really adversely affected. So that was
Yeah.
why I wanted you to come. I didn't look for you to be a trafficker. Good
Well, I
news.
appreciate that.
Yeah,
Yeah, and and that's part of the issue, and I think that that's part of the opportunity. Although more people coming is not always opportunity. But this idea at the time that I was researching the book, and I think that the issues evolved a little bit in the past couple of years. But it's a little bit simplistic to say that the Great Lakes region, the Rust Belt of the United States, is a place where cities across that region peaked their populations
yeah,
in the late 1970s and have been in decline. And there's been, depending on where you are, if you're in um, Detroit or Buffalo, then there, at least for a long time, was an economic decline that went along with that, population decline. And so from an infrastructure perspective, from a footprint of the city planning perspective, a lot of people that I speak to point to the capacity that those places have, as in you could absorb a couple 100,000 people, but not have to figure out where to put them because there's already space for it.
right,
And you might have to
right.
rebuild the systems that support them living there. But that's the general idea of capacity. I think, and this is a really good thing, that the conversation around migration and climate change has evolved a good bit since the book came out, and so that conversation is getting a bit more sophisticated around um, what is good planning, and how do you grab onto that growth opportunity. How do you not become overwhelmed by that growth, if that's that is something that I hear in rural communities in particular,
Mhm.
afraid of too many people coming in. And so you can look at that issue of capacity, I think, in a little bit more sophisticated way than simply like how many lanes of highway are
Right.
are underutilized in Detroit. But that's the basic idea is it's not a crowded part of the country compared to California, where I live, where it sometimes feels like there's not room for, one more person.
Right. I understood. I understood. Well, is there any other last thoughts you have about your time in Ann Arbor or things that you've learned since the book that you'd want to share?
Just that it's been a really fantastic experience, engaging in this issue during my recent visit to Ann Arbor, but also, when I came to report on the book, and when I was there recently, had an opportunity to check in with a couple of those experts that informed the book writing itself, and it's been really, wonderful to see like this part of the country really on the front point of this issue. I do travel around and I talk about this in a lot of places, and some places are in denial, some places are uninterested, and when I've been, in Michigan in particular. Uh, Communities, not just yours, including yours, are extremely engaged and really thoughtful about the future. And I think that's a really, that's what it's going to take. I mean, if change of one kind or another, is underway, you can either be on your heels or your toes for it. And I've been impressed by um,
Yeah, I think
how engaged people are.
my comment on that is, having been my experience in my career, that many times the creative solutions come locally, uh, regionally, or from a state perspective. I think we're at a stage now where those kind of decisions and ideas bubbling up are going to be what's going to take us forward, as opposed to sort of a top-down federal government sort of approach. So it's interesting to live in a community that is so focused on this. Um, and there are the conflicting, as you described. We're experiencing growth. Folks want to have a sustainable community. What does that mean in terms of your land use plan? How do you proceed and all of that? But
Mhm.
being fully informed and thoughtful is really important, I think, at this point, in our history. So anyway, I want to thank you for the time that you spent here. Thank you for your
My
research and
pleasure.
work. We'll certainly follow you and see what you bring to our attention next. And good luck.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for supporting this topic and my book, and it's a real pleasure to connect with you.
Great. And I want to thank our audience for listening and learning more from experts and leaders and organizations working hard to create the future of our economy here in Ann Arbor. These conversations are brought to you by Ann Arbor Spark. For more information about Ann Arbor Spark, you can find us on the web at annarborusa.org and also on Facebook and LinkedIn. And you can find On the Move on Amazon. It's easy to find. So if you haven't gotten a copy or read it, I would encourage you to do so.